Erica and I were so busy schmoozing that we almost forgot to come out here.
Right.
Ted has actually asked me to do the formal introduction, although I think you all know who this very significant person is beside me, Erica Jong, who is a poet and a writer, who has written many works. Tonight we're here talking about specifically Fear of Flying, which has its 40th anniversary, hard to believe, and a book that I suspect many of us all read and found significantly important in our lives. So welcome, Erica.
Thank you. Thank you.
Actually, she and I would really like to talk about our dogs, but we're not.
Right.
We're not going to. We're going to stay on topic.
Dogs are important, though.
They're
They're very important.
They are.
Actually, the new novel I'm writing has a long chapter on the dog I lost while writing the book, and they play a huge part in our lives.
You know, it's funny. I mean, while I'm joking about that, I'd also argue that unconditional love, which is an important issue in Fear of Flying, the idea of a love that exists without demand, is in fact something that people get from their pets, a kind of love where there's no requirement attached to it.
Only mopping up the piss and shit.
Right.
And Fear of Flying was published in 1973, in November of 1973. And when it first came out, nobody knew what it would be, really. I certainly didn't. I was terrified writing it. I had no idea what it was that I had wrought. Half the time my heart was beating so fast, I didn't know, but I was also laughing hysterically. And I knew that I was doing something outrageous, but I wasn't quite sure what.
And so you dove into doing this with the idea that you were going to, you were a serious academic at the time, and how did you even begin the project? What did you intend?
Well, throughout my 20s, I was trying to write a novel. Mm-hmm. I was writing poetry. I always wrote poetry, and poetry is in many ways the source of everything I do, because it's my entry into the unconscious. It's my entry into the primary process, which all writers have to go into in order to imagine things. But throughout my 20s, I was noodling on a novel. And I knew that it would have certain elements. But interestingly, I first wrote it from a man's point of view. Because at that time, the novels that were praised, for the most part, were written by men. Updike, Bellow, Philip Roth. And I wrote the novel from the point of view of the character of the madman in Fear of Flying. And I had a wonderful editor at Holt, a guy called Aaron Asher, who was Philip Roth's editor and Saul Bellow's editor, and a very literary editor. And he loved my writing, and in fact, he had published 2 books of my poetry, Fruits and Vegetables and Half-Lives. And when I brought him this novel, which contained many of the elements in Fear of Flying, it was called The Man Who Murdered Poets. And it was about a man who was so jealous. It was very derivative of Nabokov, who in my 20s was my favorite writer, like so many of us. And I now don't like Nabokov as much as I did. I think he's tricky and evasive. I love Panine and Lolita. I don't like the other books so much, and I think he's a damnable snob. But, and a lot of his writing is about snobbery, actually. But I wrote this novel about a man who wants to be a great poet, So he murders a great poet in order to take on his gifts. I brought this novel to Aaron, and Aaron read it, and he said, "This is publishable," he said without enthusiasm. "This is okay. Take it down the street to so-and-so. Anyone will publish it. But why the hell don't you write a novel in the voice of those poems? That is something new." And another woman writing in the voice of a Nabokovian madman, who the hell needs it? And honest to God, it was the right comment at the right moment. And I bless him for that. I mean, he's gone to that great editorial meeting in the sky. But it was exactly the right thing to say, because the voice in the poems was outrageous, funny, rambunctious, sensuous. It dealt with fruits and vegetables. It dealt with Chinese food. It dealt with sexuality, many things. But what he was right was that that was a voice that I should have written a novel in. And I took that and went home and tore apart what I had and wrote a novel in the voice of my poems.
And how long did it take you?
That version took me maybe a year. But I'd been working on the novel for a decade. When I lived in Germany, when I was writing poems, it was constantly in work. And many things in the novel come out of that earlier book, which I cannibalized. But I think that the 20s are a very difficult time. You don't know who you are. You tend to imitate the writers you love. In my case, I adored Nabokov. And you tend to try to copy them, which is not a bad way to learn to write. But at a certain moment, you find your voice. And when I teach writing seminars, I always say to my students, there will come a time after you've copied all your favorite writers, whether Virginia Woolf, Vladimir Nabokov, whoever, when suddenly you will start to write in a voice that is yours about a subject that is yours. And when you find that, it will be the most exciting moment of your life.
And was that what it felt like? Suddenly said, "This
When
is
he
me."
released me to write in the voice of my poem, everything happened. Everything followed from that.
As you were writing it, did you hesitate about any aspect of it? The frankness, the intimacy of the tone? Were there moments
I hesitated all the time. I mean, I was scared to death. Look, I was so compulsive about my writing that I couldn't even type it up. I used to write, and I still do often, on yellow legal pads in felt pen. And I hired a Barnard student, whom I paid by the hour, to type my drafts, because I didn't trust myself to type my own drafts. Because I would have been so compulsive, I wouldn't have been able to get a draft out. And that was how I came to have an amanuensis, because I didn't trust myself. When I started committing the work to the typewriter, in those days it was an IBM Selectric, with a little mushroom cap.
Oh, God, yes.
I didn't trust myself to type my own work because I would get so uptight about it. So I hired this young woman. Her name was Mimi Balin. She was a Barnard student who needed some extra money. And she would come over at about 4 o'clock every day, take my pages, go in the other room, and type. And I would hear gales of laughter coming out of the guest room. And that was the first notion I had that I was doing something good, that Mimi was laughing and laughing. And I would say to her, "Can I really write this?" She said, "Well, you have, and it's damned funny." So that was very important.
In that interim between finishing the book and the book actually coming out and being published, what was your anticipation? I mean, was it still something where you thought, who knows, people could just...
I was terrified. And because I was married to a psychoanalyst, we had to go to Cape Cod for the month of August. It is written in the psychoanalytic DSM whatever that every psychoanalyst must rent a house in Wellfleet or Truro on the Cape for the month of August. And so we did. And I remember we had rented a house on the beach, a little bit fancier than the house we rented the previous year, maybe because I had my $15,000 book advance. I'm not sure. It was very small by any standards you could name. And I remember lying awake in bed at night, hearing the surf crashing outside, and thinking, I'm going to call the printing press and take it back. I am going to call my editor and say I can't publish it. I cannot, and I would be drenched in sweat. I was scared to death about publishing it.
Scared because of what the reaction would be, what it would do for your career?
Self-exposure. All writing is self-exposure. You can be writing about your interview with Putin, and you will expose yourself. This is what fledgling writers don't know. Whether you're a pundit writing political commentary or a novelist writing intimate stuff, you are always exposing yourself. And there's no way not to if you're going to be an honest writer. I mean, you know that, Susan. And so we are always afraid of self-exposure. We're afraid we'll be laughed at, we'll be heckled. That is what's so hard about being a writer. It almost doesn't matter what the subject is. If you're an honest writer, you're exposing yourself.
Certainly. This was a book that was a kind of voice that hadn't been heard before. Had there been a woman who had published a book that was similar to this at that point?
Well, 10 years earlier, Doris Lessing published The Golden Notebook. And it was a very important book to me. It was published the year I graduated from college. I don't think it was known by as wide an audience. It was read by more intellectual readers. But it kept getting reprinted and people kept loving it. And what was interesting to me about The Golden Notebook was that here is a woman who's a political creature. She is also a sexual creature. She is also a mother. And each of her roles is notated in a journal. There's the political journal, the sexual journal, the writing journal. And what she longs for most of all is to bring all those beings together into one journal, which is the Golden Notebook. And her longing is to be a woman of the body, a woman of the soul, and a woman of the mind. And that was what women were not allowed to be. And Doris Lessing knew that. So that was, for me, a very freeing book. At the end of The Golden Notebook, the character, Anna Wolf, has a mad love affair with a man. And she, the character, Anna, is going slightly mad. And she's pinning newspaper clippings all over her room. And they're all things that portend the end of the world. Lessing is a very prophetic writer, like all great writers. Anyway, her lover says to her, "You will never finish the novel you're writing until you bring all your notebooks together." And he writes the first line of The Golden Notebook and gives it to her as a gift of love. And what she's longing to do is to bring the body, the soul, the mind together, as women for centuries were not allowed to do. So that was a very freeing book. The other book that freed me was Portnoy's Complaint. And suddenly, in 1969, because of a couple of really important court cases filed by Barney Rossett and others, we could suddenly read Lady Chatterley's Lover in a paperback. We could read Tropic of Cancer, which previously you had to go to Paris and buy in an Olympia Press edition. We could read all these books. They were available. And so censorship was dead. And Roth responded by writing Portnoy's Complaint, and Updike responded by writing Couples. And these were both books that blasted sexuality out of the closet. And I remember reading them and saying, but a woman has to do this. Now, Lessing began it, I think, because she wrote about, She wrote about things that I'd never read before in a woman's novel. The smell of your own menstrual blood. How you love it and you hate it because it means you didn't have a baby that month. She wrote about these things. She says in the book, her heroine, Anna Wolf, says, I know we're supposed to be free, but I never have an orgasm if I don't love the man. So she was touching on these subjects, and that was very freeing. But when I read Portnoy and Couples, I thought, well, where's the woman's book that talks honestly about these things? So that was inspiring to me.
And was your publisher supportive? Were they anxious the way you were as they were?
No, because we were in 1971, 72. Everybody wanted to know, what do women think? We were on the heels of the second wave. People wanted to know what women were thinking. And so I remember I finished nearly the whole book. I ran into Aaron's office. I plopped it on his desk, and he said, I was beginning to think there was no book. I ran out and went immediately to Cape Cod. Seems my whole life in those days was Cape Cod. And he called me a week later, and he said, it has everything. It has the ambivalence, it has the feminism, it has men and women and the impossibility of their relationships. He said, it's phenomenal. Of course it needs editing. And of course, zipless fuck is completely ungrammatical, and we'll have to change that. But he responded with heart, which was really wonderful.
You know, would you, while we're talking about that phrase, read the portion that you had marked?
Early in the book, Isadora Wing has a fantasy. And it's the fantasy of the zipless fuck, which became more famous than the book itself. You know, I am not famous, the zipless fuck is famous. When I appear on NPR, I have to call it the zipless bleep. A family radio program or television program. Okay. Here we are. Growing up female in America, what a liability. You grew up with your ears full of cosmetic ads, love songs, advice columns, horoscopes, Hollywood gossip, and moral dilemmas on the level of TV soap operas. What litanies the advertisers of the good life chanted at you. What curious catechisms. Be kind to your behind. Blush like you mean it. Love your hair. Want a better body? We'll rearrange the one you've got. That shine on your face should come from him, not from your skin. You've come a long way, baby. How to score with every male in the zodiac, the stars and sensual you. To a man they say cutty sark. A diamond is forever. If you're concerned about douching, length and coolness come together. How I solved my intimate odor problem. Lady, be cool. Every woman alive loves Chanel No. 5. What makes a shy girl get intimate? Femme. We named it after you. What all the ads and all the horoscopes seemed to imply was that if only you were narcissistic enough, if only you took proper care of your smells, your hair, your boobs, your eyelashes, your armpits, your crotch, your stars, your scars, and your choice of scotch in bars, you would meet a powerful, potent, and rich man who would satisfy every longing, fill every hole, make your heart skip a beat or stand still, make you misty, and fly you to the moon, preferably on gossamer wings. And you would be totally satisfied forever. And the crazy part of it was that even if you were clever, even if you'd spent your adolescence reading John Donne and Shaw, even if you studied history or zoology or physics and hoped to spend your life pursuing some difficult and challenging career, you still had a mind full of all the soupy longings that every high school girl was awash in. It didn't matter, you see, whether you had an IQ of 170 or an IQ of 70. You were brainwashed all the same. Only the surface trappings were different. You expected not to desire any other men after marriage, and you expected your husband not to desire any other women. And then the desires came, and you were thrown into a panic of self-hatred. What an evil woman you were! How could you keep being infatuated with strange men? How could you study their bulging trousers like that? How could you sit at a meeting imagining how every man in the room would screw? How could you sit on a train fucking total strangers with your eyes? How could you do that to your husband? Did anyone ever tell you it had nothing to do with your husband? And what about those other longings which marriage stifled? The longings to hit the road from time to time, to discover whether you could still live alone inside your head, to discover whether you could manage to survive in a cabin in the woods without going mad, to discover, in short, whether you were still whole after so many years of being half of something, like the two back legs of a horse outfit on the vaudeville stage. 5 years of marriage had made me itchy for all those things, itchy for men, and itchy for solitude, itchy for sex, and itchy for the life of a recluse. I knew my itches were contradictory, and that made things even worse. I knew my itches were un-American, and that made things still worse. It is heresy in America to embrace any way of life except as half of a couple. Solitude is un-American. It may be condoned in a man, especially if he is, quote, a glamorous bachelor who, quote, dates starlets during a brief interval between marriages, but a woman alone is always presumed to be alone as a result of abandonment, not choice. Oh, she can get along financially, perhaps, but not as well as a man, but emotionally she's never left in peace. Her friends, her family, her fellow workers never let her forget that her husbandlessness, her childlessness, her selfishness, in short, is a reproach to the American way of life. My response to all of this was not yet to have an affair and not yet to hit the open road, but to evolve my fantasy of the zipless fuck. The zipless fuck was more than a fuck. It was a platonic ideal. Zipless because when you came together, zippers fell away like rose petals. Underwear blew off in one breath like dandelion fluff. Tongues intertwined and turned liquid. Your whole soul flowed out through your tongue and into the mouth of your lover, etc. Okay, so she... So one little bit more, one scenario of the zipless fuck. Zipless, you see, not because European men have button flies rather than zipper flies, and not because the participants are so devastatingly attractive, but because the incident has all the swift compression of a dream and is seemingly free of all remorse and guilt, because there is no talk of her late husband or his fiancé, there is no rationalizing, there is no talk of anything. The zipless fuck is absolutely pure, and I have never had one.
That's wonderful. You know, one thing I want to say, just as a writer rereading this book, is to appreciate how beautifully it's written, and in all of the you know, drama around it and the significance of it in a social way. I would just like to put in a comment here that it is a piece of beautiful writing that's a real pleasure to read. When I read it the first time when I was in high school, it was just to read the dirty parts.
But they're not that dirty.
Well, that's what's so interesting. And you know, this is a book this doesn't happen very often, where the ripples that it created have, to some degree, sort of obscured what the book as a book is about. I actually think it's in many ways a book so much more about being in your 20s and struggling with the questions of ambition and professional ambition as much as the idea of sexuality, or maybe even more. I mean, or maybe reading it at this age, I see it very differently.
Well, you know, it's very important that Isadora is 29 looking at her 30th birthday. And that sets a lot of things in motion in the book. I think the 20s are an incredibly difficult time. I think they're a continuation of adolescence in a way. We never, when our children are going through their 20s, we never credit them in that way. It's a very tumultuous time. We really don't know who we are, girls and boys both. And those of us who grew up in the 50s and got married in our early 20s, before we knew who we were, you know, we had these starter marriages that were very difficult to get out of. In my case, I really did have a husband who thought he was Jesus Christ and thought he could walk on water and fly through the window. I mean, I had this brilliant husband who became schizophrenic, who I wrote a version of in this book. But I loved his intelligence. But we don't really know who we are. So how can we make a good marriage that will last? People say, oh, you've been married 4 times. Well, the only marriage that I think is a real marriage made by adults is the marriage I made in my 40s, which is now 24, almost 25 years old. Before then, I don't even think I knew what I wanted.
Even though we're talking about this as a 40th anniversary and the world has changed.
A lot, yeah.
I mean, so much of the context has changed. But the fundamentals, to me, and feel free to argue, haven't really changed. It's about growing up. It's about making a life choice in terms of a partner, and it's about for women, in spite of everything that feminism has done, I don't know that it's that different. The conflict about wanting a career and what you think being a wife means.
And wanting children. And wanting children, but also wanting to keep your identity, which is the hardest thing in the world when you have a child. I think America is a very tough country to be a mother in or a father, because all the support systems that other democracies have, we don't have. We don't have maternity and paternity leave. We don't have early childhood education. I mean, Holland has this, France has it, the UK has it, not to mention the Scandinavian countries, which, you know, all have it. Many democracies have support for parents. People in America can't even take the first year of their child's life off work. In many other countries, they can, and they're supported. So we're a country that pretends to love children, but we have so many starving children in this country. We have a Congress that will cut food stamps, supposedly to save money, but really it increases expenses in a million other ways. We have infant mortality rates that are outrageous compared to the country we have. So the next step, I think, for feminism in this country is support for mothers and fathers, which we don't have, early childhood education. The other thing is, the countries that really have a lot of female leaders, Denmark is one, Holland is another, are countries that long ago made a quota system and said, if women are 50% of the population, women must be 50% of the legislature. We have never
Can you imagine that here?
done that. Many European countries have done that. And now they have legislatures that are 50% women. I think that feminism cannot triumph in this country until we have early childhood education, support for mothers and fathers, and quota systems for legislators. That's how other countries achieved it.
Have we made much progress in 40 years? Have we made a different world than what you were writing about in?
I think America has gone backwards. If you look at Roe v. Wade, and then you look at the fact that in Texas, they're making abortion unobtainable, in the gigantic state of Texas. If you look at the fact that in Virginia, they've passed laws which are unconstitutional that mandate putting a probe up a woman's vagina when she's pregnant and giving a sonogram, even though the OBGYN says it's useless. They are passing laws in many states that they know to be unconstitutional, that they know will be struck down, but it will put NARAL and Planned Parenthood out of business because they will have to spend all their money on litigation rather than providing clinics for women. These clinics are the only health care certain women get. So it's not just that they get birth control and abortion, they get health care. Mm-hmm. And it's the only health care certain women who are struggling ever get. So, I mean, there's such hypocrisy in this country about equality, women. And all of this is exacerbated by the enormous gap between rich and poor now. So in the state of Texas, the rich women will get abortions, they'll get birth control, they'll get IUDs, they'll get whatever they want, pills, and poor women will have more and more children, which they won't be able to raise. And this is such a retrograde philosophy for the planet, for ecology, for the equality of our society. It's ghastly.
You feel that in this 40 years, we've moved backward.
Well, people's expectations have moved forward. I meet women in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s who are living alone and are happy. Mm-hmm. That I didn't see in the 60s and 70s. Many women live by themselves, live with female partners, live with partners who are not lovers, or live by themselves and are exuberant and happy. And that is new. I see a lot of hope. I see a lot of, among young women, I see a lot of joy in being able to do certain things. But do they get the economic support? No. And do they have support for their parenthood? No. And in other countries, people take that for granted.
In the book, there's such a strong section of a concern about what will I be if I'm alone and I don't have a husband. And I wonder if you see that as different now from at the point that you wrote the book.
I think that educated women don't feel that panic to the same degree until they reach that moment when they feel their biological clock ticking. And that happens to women at different times. It happened to me at 32, 33. And the reason I finally got pregnant with my daughter was because I had begun adopting all the stray dogs in Connecticut. And I didn't want to admit that I wanted a child. And I had a friend at that time, an older actress named June Havoc, darling baby June, who was Gypsy Rose Lee's older sister. And she was crazy about animals. And every time there was a shelter in Connecticut that was about to euthanize dogs, June would call me and she'd say, "Darling, we must go down to Elmsford. They're going to euthanize 20 dogs. And we must go down, and we must do interviews." So we would go down there, and if there was some important news on some war or something, or peace talks or something, no press would come. So June and I would both adopt 3 dogs. And so at one point I adopted a marvelous mutt we called her Virginia Wolf. She was a big red mutt like the dog in Annie. She was gorgeous. but she had worms and she shat all over the house. And I took her to a vet, and the vet said, "Put this dog down. She'll never be a pet." I nursed her back to health. And when we got rid of the worms, we discovered somebody had painstakingly trained her. She would go to the door and go, "Ruff, ruff," when she had to go. And she was perfectly trained. She was just sick. And I nursed her back to health. And I had many other rescues at that time in my life. And at some moment, when my friend June called, I thought, "Jong, you better get pregnant." I was friends with an actress called Sandy Dennis in those days, who had a house in Connecticut. And she had about 300 cats. And you'd come into, the back door was always open, and you'd come into the house at night, and all these eyes would look at you. And I thought, this will happen to me if I don't have a child.
And all the cats.
And that's how I knew I had to have a baby, really.
What did you, as a mother, try to convey to your daughter about the idea of gender and feminism and who she might turn out to be?
I was very into girl power, always. And I told her that we believed that God was the mother goddess and et cetera. You know, I was very into female divinities at that point in my life, although I really know that if there is a deity, it does not have a gender. I know that. But, you know, I was into girl power. And I'm doing that with my little granddaughter, Bet. Every summer, we take a girls' trip. And last summer, we went to London, and Bet wanted to see all the places that were associated with Elizabeth I of England. She never married, Grandma, and she was the greatest queen England ever had. So we schlepped all over London and the countryside, and we saw Hatfield House, where Elizabeth was raised, and all this stuff. And we had to rescue Bet from her two brothers for a week and take her to London. So I'm very into girl power, and I love having girls. I love the little boys in my life, too. I adore them. But I'm very into, I told Molly she could do whatever she wanted. And Molly is an incredible boss, a boss. She rules the roost. She tells everyone what to do, including me. And my greatest fear in life is that someday I might have to live with my daughter. Because she'll put me in the garage, I know, with the dogs. Molly is fierce. She's very funny, but she's also she has the same birthday as Bill Clinton, August 19th. She's a Leo. And there is no doubt when Molly and I are together of who's in charge.
Has it been like that since she was little? Was that just who she was?
That's who she is. She's exuberant. She's a Leo. She is determined. She knows what she wants. And her husband obeys. And so do her kids.
So do you consider it a success?
I consider it a great success. She married a man who has an incredibly bossy mother. And I think that's the secret of life. Always marry a man who has a bossy mother and feels comfortable with you telling him what to do.
Got to work on that. When the book first came out, what was the initial reaction? And were you simply swept up in a kind of storm of acknowledgement?
No, the early reviews, I mean, there was a lot of controversy from the beginning. The early reviews were everything from another whiny feminist novel to it's all pornography. And then, after a little while, John Updike wrote this review in The New Yorker, in which he said that it was the smart Jewish kid on the couch, Holden Caulfield, had he been a woman. Alexander Portnoy, had he been a woman. And he gave the book its place in a way, that it was, he understood it. And he didn't write about it exclusively as a feminist book or a sexual book. He wrote about it as the female version of Catcher in the Rye or Portnoy, which was far closer to what I was trying to do. And that, suddenly the book sold out everywhere. They hadn't printed a lot of copies, by the way, because everybody thought it was a very literary book in those days. Anyway, the review came late. I later learned from John Updike, because William Shawn, who was then editor of The New Yorker and who was famously prudish, would not let John quote at length from the book. So they seemed to have a battle for several months, and the review came out right before Christmas, so 6 weeks after publication. Then it sort of got its due. What is this female Catcher in the Rye? He sort of put people on the right track, in a way. And then people started reviewing it. I remember a piece in the New York Times Magazine, "Who's Afraid of Erica Jong?" And it was an older woman writer denouncing me, essentially. But it was ink, huge amounts of ink. And most of the early responses were very controversial.
Was it a pleasure or sometimes a burden to be associated with a project, something you produce that literally everybody is?
It was quite fearful. Up until then, I had been a poet who won prizes from Poetry Magazine. I was a graduate student at Columbia. My telephone number was in the book. And suddenly, men were calling me up and wanting to fuck me, and women wanted to come and move in with me because they were leaving their husbands. I had no idea what fame in America meant. That you became Miss Lonely Hearts, and everybody thought you were sexually available. And then when articles came out in People and other places with pictures of me, and those were the days I had long hair down to my pupik and mini skirts, up to my pussy, and I was young, and I had long blonde hair, and I radiated a kind of sexuality in those days. It was pretty scary. America's a very puritanical country. And I remember getting letters like, only commie kike bitches like you would write a book like Fear of Flying.
Wow.
So the anti-Semitism came out of the woodwork. The anti-communism, there was a lot of meanness too.
Looking back now, is it a remarkable thing to think here we are 40 years later talking about this book? That must be immensely
It's
satisfying.
almost hard to conceive. In the wake of this book, which has been published in China, Korea, Serbia, Croatia, I have traveled around the world, and what I've discovered is that nearly everywhere I've gone, Turkey, Japan, women have identified with the book and said, you have written the story of my life. So I've now had the experience of seeing how similar women's lives are the world over, which is remarkable. Women worry about a few things in their lives. They worry about freedom. They want to control their own bodies. They want political input, which they want education. Those are the constants. They do not want somebody else to tell them, men to tell them what they can do with their uteruses. They want to be educated, and they want their children to be safe. These are such universal concerns that it blew my mind going around the world. So the book has taken me on an education of a different sort.
Has it been banned?
Well, it was at one point banned in Italy, which then made it
Italy? Oh my
incredibly.
God.
There was some prosecutor in Aquila. It has always been very popular in Italy. It's always been very popular. The French originally didn't want to publish it because they said, French men take care of French women. They do
Oh
not
my
need
God.
psychoanalysts. And then they published it and sold 500,000 copies in France. Germany, it sold 1 million copies. It's done very well around the world, but what has struck me is how similar women's wishes are everywhere I've gone. I've had women in Turkey say to me, I could be your Isadora. It's amazing to me. And the book was, for many years, pirated in China in unofficial editions. Now there is an official Chinese translation. It's just come out, so I haven't gotten much feedback, but I really will be curious about that one.
That's interesting that it cuts across that many cultural lines.
We think these cultures are different, but women's needs are remarkably similar. Think of Malala saying, this 16-year-old Afghani woman who was shot in the head, and who says, we want to go to school.
Yeah.
We want to be educated. We want to control our uteruses. I mean, these are basic things without which you can't be a free being.
Do you, I see Ted standing up, so I think
Yeah.
we're coming close to our time for questions, which is maddening because I have many, many other questions for you. Is a zipless fuck possible?
I think it's very hard to come by. I mean, nowadays, young women in college have hookups. Or some people will connect on the internet and meet and have sex without feeling. I don't get the feeling from the young women who talk to me, and believe me, everybody I meet tells me about their sex life. I cannot sit on a plane, a train, or a bus but without somebody telling me the whole story of their sex life, which is kind of an honor, but you know, sometimes you want to read your book too. But I don't get the feeling that the hookups are very satisfying. I get the feeling that women are doing the pleasuring. I get the feeling that there's a lot of impotence out there, and young women tell me that they do a lot of oral sex with their hookups. And I say, why? These men are in their 20s. Why are you doing only oral sex? And they say, well, they get scared. They can't get an erection. I'm not quite sure why. Is it only because we're powerful now or is it because they've jerked off so much on the internet that they've got nothing left? Which has also been proposed. But I don't get the feeling that the hookups, with some exceptions, of course, are very satisfying for the young women. But I'm not a young woman, so who knows? You'll have to tell me.
Just to follow up on that, the thing that if we had another hour, I would love to talk about is, you know, sometimes I think that we've got the trappings of feminism, and what's really happened is, in certain ways, I think it's a lot harder for women.
Much harder, because there are so many decisions that we have to make. First of all, yes, the careers are open, but are they really open? The money-making jobs are still overwhelmingly male. The people, yes, women are editors, yes, women run magazines, but the people who run the money are nearly always men. Same with movie studios, same with media, same with Fortune 500 companies. You can name on the fingers of one hand the ones that are run by women. Fewer and fewer. Women in the pipeline, there's supposed to be a lot of women in the pipeline. I see women mostly in middle management. Because we don't have the underpinnings for feminism. We don't have maternity and paternity leave, and we don't have early childhood education. So if you're Sheryl Sandberg, and you have millions of dollars, and you have 4 nannies and a driver, sure, you don't have to make a choice. But suppose you don't have 4 nannies and a driver. How are you going to do it? Suppose you can't even afford the part-time babysitter. How are you going to do it? And I deeply resent women like the lean-in woman, Sandberg, who make it appear that everyone can do what she has done. Nobody shows this, nobody shows the support system. When a great actress is interviewed, they don't photograph the nanny or the cook or, the driver who takes the kid to school. How do you think that you do this?
Well, and I think that's the subject that I would love to talk about further, which is the idea that you are expected to do more. It's not that you now found a wife figure for all of these couples, and that you have two people who can be equally ambitious professionally, and this third party. I mean, maybe we need a triangulated marriage where there's a third person who's, it seems to me that that women in a funny way have ended up in a worse position because they are expected to do everything.
Absolutely. I think it's difficult.
I mean,
and without the basic underpinning. I go to Amsterdam, I visit my Dutch publisher. After she had children, she works 4 days a week. Her husband, they're both editors, works 4 days a week. On the days that they're not available, and there is a creche near their house with great teachers, and the kids can go there at 3 months old. And it's paid for by the government, by their taxes. So there are none of these horrible choices to make. Do I stay home? Do I find the perfect nanny? What is the perfect nanny? When Molly was little and I was the sole breadwinner, I went from nanny to nanny to nanny. I had one nanny who ran over my beloved dog and escaped with the carpenter who was building my new studio. All of these things happens to everybody, but it's just a little funny. But we don't have any of the supports that other democracies have, and yet we have the expectation that we will do everything. Raising children is incredibly labor intensive. They need you every minute, except when they're in school. And when they're little, they go to school for just a few hours. And I now have these wonderful grandchildren, but my daughter has, at this point in her life, a nanny, a housekeeper, a driver, and a grandmother who appears whenever needed, and other grandmothers who appear whenever needed. Those kids take a lot of energy, and they all go to different schools in different parts of the city. It's a lot of work. It's a full-time, more than full-time, it's day and night job, because sometimes they don't want to go to sleep.
I could talk forever. I would like to make sure we have time here for some questions.
So what do you think about the talk of cougars? Everybody talks about that now, that's like a big thing of women, older women going after younger men. Is that like a feminist thing, or do you think that that's sort of backward?
It's a lot of fun. I mean, I can only tell you that when I turned 40, I had a 25-year-old lover. And it was my 40th birthday present to myself. And I lived with him for about 4.5 years, and it was great fun. And then at a certain moment in my life, I realized that Molly was a baby and he was a baby. And I can't tell you really how it ended, but I didn't let him take the car I bought for him. And I sort of outgrew it, but I'm really glad I did it. It was a lot of fun. And I don't know if it's feminist. I think sensual women have always taken younger lovers. At every period in history, if they could do it, if they had the time. And if they, read Colette's Chérie in The Last of Chérie. There's nothing like turning 40 and having a 26-year-old lover. But it doesn't last forever. Anyway, my opinion.
Given that we have more work to do toward equality, what's your take on younger women who are feminists, who have benefited from feminism, but who reject the term feminism?
Well, you know, do you know that English writer called Caitlin Moran? Irish writer, really. She says, do you have a uterus? Do you want to be in charge of it? You're a feminist. Do you work? Do you want to be fairly paid for your work? You're a feminist. Do you have a kid? Do you want the best for your kid? You're a feminist. I mean, this is really semantic bullshit. A woman says, I want equal pay. I want choice. I don't want to have babies if I don't want to have them, but I'm not a feminist. This is merely women rebelling against their mother's generation. Perfectly normal and natural, but their feminism is defined by what they want, not by the label.
Well, also, hasn't some of that been a very clever demonizing of the label by the right?
Exactly right.
Much the way the word liberal has, you know, it's almost uncomfortable to say I'm a liberal because it again
You are absolutely right, Susan. There was a great, after the second wave, and the second wave made many mistakes. We don't have to get into that, but they did. We did. I was considered a bad sister because I wore lipstick and high heels, whatever, which has nothing to do with being a good sister or a bad sister. But anyway, I would say to you that we had a huge reaction from the right wing, a fear reaction. We had Bush, we had Cheney, we had the right trying to scare everybody about the freedoms of women. And we had the corporate press echoing this. And so feminism became a dirty word. You're absolutely right about that.
Hi, I'm 29 and just read Fear of Flying for the first time about 2 months ago. I'm over here. And I was really taken by Isadora's, in the final act, having to go through a long train ride on her period. And I'd never read anything like that. And I'd read all of Updike and Roth and Mailer and all that. So I was just wondering what motivated, because it's lengthy and it's detail and it's such a part of that sets Isadora apart from everybody else, and it's such a female experience. I just wanted to hear what you were thinking about when you were writing that and why you decided to put that in, and if there was any reaction. I'm sorry, that was like 8 questions.
One critic pointed out ages ago that the action of the book is one menstrual cycle. And it's true, that at the end of the book, she gets her period in Paris. At the beginning of the book, she's finishing a period. My unconscious was very smart, so the book is 28 days. But I think that some of the experiences women have to be written about in order to document our lives honestly. I hope I do it with humor, but I think it's important. You know, we're half the human race, more than half the human race, and I think our experiences have to be addressed in literature. And now that we have gotten rid of censorship, we can do it.
Hi. I have a question about nuts and bolts about the book, and that is making it into a movie. Your book after Fear of Flying was about the process of turning the book into a movie, especially with Susan sitting next to you. Can you talk about that? How Fear of Flying
It never became a movie, and someday I will write a huge tome about all the efforts to make a movie. There is another effort underway now. Whether it will ever be a movie or not, I can't tell you, but you had one of your books, your Orchid book, made into quite a lovely movie, but it was quite different from the book. Has to be, I think.
Yeah. I mean, Fear of Flying, it's funny, reading it, I kept thinking, wait, wasn't Was there never a movie made
Never,
of this?
never.
Which is surprising, but I'm looking forward to reading your treatise on why it hasn't happened.
Women are not the centerpiece of movies. In the last 30 years, women have not been the central characters in movies. You can name the movies in which that happened. They're very few. But why don't you talk about your experience of having your book made into a movie? It's very different. It's a different form.
Oh, yeah. And certainly for me, it was very easy to distance myself from. It was like loaning someone a sweater and saying, you know, it doesn't look the same on you as it looked on me, and return it when you're done. And and I feel like I had a very lucky experience because I loved the movie that was made.
The movie was wonderful.
And I'm glad it wasn't exactly the book. They're totally different forms.
Exactly.
So I can imagine a film of Fear of Flying would follow the story more literally because it's a narrative that makes sense in a cinematic way. But you've really made me curious.
Well, we'll
you can
see if this
tell
ever
me.
happens, you know. We'll see if it happens. I mean, the whole saga of trying to make the movie has been a 40-year saga. And it's impossible for me to summarize it, but it could be a funny book.
Very.
Anyway.
Hi. I'm raising a 12-year-old daughter, and she's experiencing exactly what you read, or I'm experiencing watching her with the hair and the this and the that, especially with all the technology now. And aside from just sort of the girl power message, are there any other specific ways that I can really support her in finding her own inner strength separate from all that other stuff? I mean, I'm considering making her watch Killing Me Softly, right? Gene Kilborn's movie. But she's so disconnected to anything related to the feminist movement. I mean, none of her peers are. So just love your thoughts on that.
Well, you know, I think it's gotten worse for women, the female adornment stuff. I see young women. They're all doing cleanses and drinking green juice. And the amount of maintenance that goes into the hair, the skin, the boobs, the clothes, it's gotten worse. I mean, I read that passage which sort of related what it was like for someone growing up in the 50s. And now it's so much, it's just everywhere. And every magazine for women implies that you have to buy stuff to be female. And the stuff you have to buy is really expensive. We are feeding this machine of cosmetics and cleanses, and it is horrific, I think. And it starts younger and younger and younger. I mean, they're wearing makeup at 5, painting their nails at 5. I mean, it's really crazy. I think the best thing you can do is try to liberate little girls from the feeling that they have to potchki with themselves to be attractive. You don't. I mean, they're so beautiful when they're little. And the message is really about you're not good enough if you don't change yourself, your body, your hair, everything. And I think we have to liberate them from that. I mean, I'm very happy that my granddaughter, Bet, is going to a school where they wear little green uniforms and they can't compete about sparkly T-shirts and things. And she loves it. She absolutely loves it.
I just read a very scary story. I don't remember if it was in the Times about thigh gaps. It's a new obsession in
thigh gaps?
meaning that when you stand with your legs together, that you are so thin that your upper thighs don't touch. And it's, first of all, anatomically, it's not.
It's impossible.
I mean, there are like 5 people in the world who actually are built like that. But I do feel, I mean, I grew up in an era where we wouldn't have been caught dead wearing makeup. I mean, that was the whole point. Our mothers wore makeup. We didn't want to wear makeup. We wore torn up clothes and, you know,
Right.
and the total embrace of consumerism by young girls is, to me, you know, you have plenty of time to embrace consumerism when you're old and need makeup. But the
Right.
idea of, you know, these 12-year-olds getting, you know, manicures, and it is, I think, really different. It's very easy to always say, well, back when we were young, it was such and so, but that
it has
is
gotten
different.
worse. And the girls in magazines are skinnier and skinnier and skinnier. Of course, the images are photoshopped, but many of the models are 13, 14 years old. They are really young, and on top of that, they're photoshopped, and they're very, very thin. I once did a little movie for Channel 4 TV in London, where I showed the actresses of the teens and 20s in the 20th century and what they looked like before. Marlene Dietrich was a plump and sort of buxom German actress from Berlin. She came to Hollywood, she immediately shed 30 pounds. And if you just showed the images through the 20th century, starting with Marlene Dietrich and Mary Pickford, and you see the actresses getting thinner and thinner, and the models, thinner and thinner and thinner, because photography demands boniness. Many of you have seen movie stars who are teeny-weeny little people. Many of them are, you're shocked when you meet them by how petite they are, because those are the people who photograph better. So our whole society has distorted women's bodies for the sake of photography.
Well, throw in HD photography, it even advances it. It's just, it seems to me, I just don't remember being assaulted by this much imagery as a kid. And this kind, I mean, we competed over who had the more torn up jeans.
Right.
Which is still competition, but that's natural. It's just seems very different from competing about expensive clothes, fancy gel manicures, who's, you know, kids getting their hair dyed when they're 13.
It's rather shocking. I mean, if you look through a fashion magazine, you'll see girls in their 20s carrying Birkin handbags, those Hermes bags that can cost anywhere from $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 to $20,000. And you'll see a young woman in her 20s wearing jeans and carrying an Hermes bag. Nobody can afford an Hermes bag. Absolutely nobody. But she's photographed with it, and the women who read the magazine must feel somehow she's got it. Why don't they? It's really using women as victims of commercialism. A lot of it is that, and a lot of it is making women afraid that they're not good enough.
Yeah.
And our final question for tonight.
It's going to be a token male asking the question.
Oh, okay. Oh, there we are.
Where's our token male?
I'm right here. You mentioned that your book was recently released in China. They have a one child, one family policy over there for population control, which means that a lot of times, of course, a male child is preferred, and you'll see that a female child is often abandoned, sent to orphanages, or even killed because they want to have a male child. And this is leading...
Infanticide, or abortion.
Yes.
For sex selection.
This is leading to what is like an unhealthy population ratio between male and female. Now, how do you feel your book is going to come across in that kind of environment, and what do you hope that it could help spark?
God. I do think the Chinese will be very surprised when a lot of the young men cannot find wives, because the sex differential has been so skewed. And there will be a lot of Chinese young men who can't find wives because of infanticide and all of that. And I think that the powers that be in China are now reconsidering the one-child policy and thinking of allowing people to have more kids. That being said, I have absolutely no idea what impact my book will have on the one-child policy. Perhaps none. These are huge demographic problems which China is trying to face in its own way. I feel very sad about girls being killed. This also happens in India, by the way, and about sonograms being used so that women can abort female children. But in a way, it demonstrates how women are still second-class citizens. And we have to change this. We have begun a revolution for equality. We have raised consciousness, but we have not yet achieved equality. And in each country, it may have different expressions, but we have to become fully equal.
I think that's a perfect place to end. Thank you. Thank you, Erica.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you all for coming.